The title of my sermon this morning is No Plan B. One Thanksgiving, a loving wife decided that she was going to go all out that Thanksgiving and prepare the entire Thanksgiving celebration meal and cook her first turkey. Before serving it, she announced, and we're coming up on Thanksgiving, I have to tell some Thanksgiving stories. She announced to her husband and her son, "Now I know this is my first turkey I've ever cooked. If it isn't right, I don't want anybody to say a word. Nothing. We'll get up out of the table without comment, and we will go eat dinner at the local restaurant." So she retires back to the kitchen to get the turkey, and as she makes her way back into the dining room, she sees her husband and her son sitting at the table, already with their coats and hats on. Familiar doubt, right? Just anticipating that they're going to need a plan B. Unlike the movies, plan B is usually safer and less risky than plan A in real life. We go back to what's stable and easy. Our story this morning shows us that our faith can be a lot like this too when we come to God. We show up to church, we come to the table, but will God deliver the goods that matter to us? That's God's job for most folks, right? That's the good life. I talk to people and say, what do you expect God to do? They want the good life, to give them the good life, the healthy life, the free life, the stable, even if humble life. Most people now, we call that a right. Some of our rights, these basic things. We want our God-given rights. That's what He's supposed to deliver. We pray He delivers us from evil, and generally what we think that means is anything that we don't like. Things that seem to hurt us right now. In a world of options and the separation of kingdoms, which I talked about last week and the week before, most of us are unaware, and I had to do some searching inside myself. Most of us are unaware. We come to the table proverbially garbed already in plan B. John the Baptist is what we're going to talk about this morning. John the Baptist had serious problems before our story starts this morning. Jesus is going to have just sent off the disciples to go on the mission to the villages and towns, which we've talked about. And just that moment, John's disciples show up to Jesus. But John has had his own story going on. John was arrested by Herod Agrippa, King Herod Agrippa, not the Herod's son that you get from the Christmas story. Herod Agrippa, he arrested John the Baptist because John the Baptist had been saying and speaking against Herod Agrippa's incestuous relationships. And so Herod had him arrested, threw him in jail, and John is in prison. He's not doing well. He knows his life's on the line. And this doesn't fit the script that John thought he was reading from. John does not expect, he knows he's going to be speaking out against the world and he's getting in trouble, but he's definitely not thinking that he's going to stay there. We see that in this text that we're going to talk about this morning. He had been announcing that the kingdom was near. And like most Jews, he expected the powers of this world to fall, the new king to rise in power and take the place of the evil kings. Shouldn't he be free by now? That's the kind of, you can tell this is kind of what he's expecting Jesus to do. And yet Jesus was preaching things like this. We heard it in the Sermon on the Mount. Love your enemies. Love your enemies. I'm in prison. My life is shattered. Love my enemies? He's eating with sinners and tax collectors and traitors? That was not the plan. So he asks an incredibly relevant question today. In fact, some people say this may be the most relevant question anyone asks Jesus in the Gospels, the most relevant for today. Are you the expected one, or shall I look for someone else? Jesus, are you the expected one, or shall I look for someone else? So we learned three things this morning I want to talk about. The first two will be a little more extended, the last one is short. What is some of our sources of doubt? What do I do with my doubt? and believing what Jesus believed. We're going to talk about those three topics this morning after we read our verses from Matthew chapter 11, 2 through 15. Matthew 11, 2 through 15. I'm really going to be focusing mostly on 2 through 6, but I want to go ahead and read through 15. Now when John, while imprisoned, heard of the works of Christ, which is the same word as the Messiah, just to be clear, there's a "the" on that word. Now when John, while imprisoned, heard of the works of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else?" And Jesus answered and said to them, "Go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. And blessed is he who does not take offense at me." As these men were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowds about John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? But what did you see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Those who wear soft clothing are in king's palaces. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and the one who is more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it was written, 'Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you.' But truly I say to you, among those born of women there was not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and violent men take it by force. For all the prophets and the laws prophesied until John, and if you are willing to accept it, John himself is Elijah who was to come. He who has ears, let him hear." Those are the words of our Lord this morning. God doesn't deliver our kingdom. God doesn't deliver our kingdom. Noticed, just in our own time and in our own era, that as the times change, minds change. The times change minds. And boy, have the times have changed for John. Jesus seemed to John, his cousin, an adequate potential candidate for messiahship. Likely, John's mother had probably told John his whole life, right? About how John jumped for joy in the womb the moment Mary showed up pregnant with Jesus. Can you imagine that story as a family story had been passed down? Times were good then. John was more famous than Jesus at that point in his ministry. Nobody knew who Jesus was when John was baptizing and calling all of Jerusalem to come and be baptized in the waters of the Jordan. Even Josephus, the great Roman Jewish historian, actually mentions John the Baptist in his books, but there's no mention of Jesus. John was famous. Times were good. Things were looking up. The revolution was moving forward. Jesus seemed an adequate Messiah. In fact, John, when he baptized Jesus in Matthew chapter 3, Jesus walks up and John recognizes him and he says, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" That was then. But times have changed. Life's gotten hard. He says, "Are you the expected one? Or do I need to go look for a new Messiah?" Do you see that? Jesus seemed less adequate because Jesus didn't bring the revolution, the kingdom that John expected. See, Jesus recognized that his words and his deeds offended John's expectations. John imagines Jesus will use the weapons of this world to conquer it, but he doesn't do that. And that's offensive. Why? You see, Jews had dreamed of overthrowing the nations for hundreds of years. It was their interpretation of God's plan A. It was their interpretation of Isaiah and Jeremiah and the prophets. They argued it, they used it, they expected it, they depended upon it, they planned based on it. It was their interpretation, but it wasn't Jesus's. Jesus says many times that the world uses violence, but he uses love to conquer. That's really and deeply offensive then, and if we're honest, it is today. It's not realistic. It's not practical. It leaves innocent people in prison and horribly tyrannical kings in power. And we're offended. He basically says, you'll have to suffer to win. That's an extremely offensive to those who have fought with the weapons of this world for so long. I've always said that the more that you argue for something, the harder it is to change your mind, because it becomes part of your identity. It becomes part of who you are. And I've noticed that the more and more someone argues for something, the more difficult it is to let it go when you find it's right. You'd rather die than to have been wrong. I think the old idea that a false prophet is worthy of death kind of is stuck somewhere in our hearts. And we have to repent of that and let it go and be ready to change. See, John has some immediate help in sending his men to question Jesus. He sends his men. He goes, I have a problem with this. I'm going to send my people there to have this conversation with you. See, John is so honest here, right? I mean, you got to give props to John. He is so honest in his question. I mean, how many of us are honest to say, look, God, you haven't given me my kingdom or what I expected. You don't seem to be the expected one. Do I need to go look for another? How many of us would ever say that to God or to Jesus? It's such an honest question. He's offended by Jesus' love and not his judgment. Do you see that? He's offended by God's love and Jesus' love, not his judgment. He wants judgment. He's expecting judgment to fall right then and right there to the world, raining down from heaven. He's expecting God's justice. But Jesus is offering love and grace. People say today that they don't like a judgmental God. Don't believe that lie. People want a judgmental God, not a loving God. We say we want a loving God, but we want God to love us. We want God to approve of us and say, you're really good and everything is really hunky-dory, but I really would like you to bring judgment down upon my enemies. You see it in the world right now, right? All this talk of love is tolerance. It's baloney. Now it's like, if you don't agree with me, I want to cancel you. I'm going to judge you. Because the right thing to do is judgment, which is, the word should be condemnation. I'm going to condemn you. That's what people are looking for. A God who approves of their kingdom and judges their enemies. And we are so truly upset when God doesn't do what we expect him to do. We're offended at that. Save me as I am. Not come to me, not just as I am and then change me and mature me like the song says, but take me as I am and leave me alone. Give me what I want in my kingdom. See, Jesus doesn't grant John the right to a Jewish or even a Christian world right now, and he doesn't do that for us. He doesn't say, look, God-given rights are not rights that he says, I'm giving all of these people right now. That's heaven. That's how we've decided to treat one another. God has granted us this amazing gift to live by his grace, his mercy, and his love right now. He says it's love. It's the one love of God, the source of all love that brings us into willing obedience. That's what he's aiming for. Doesn't grant all the other stuff that we want. See, John's question remains humble. He doesn't say, I like how John asks this question. He doesn't say, if you don't do what I expect, I won't follow you anymore. He doesn't say that. He's literally asking the question, are you the expected one? And letting Jesus answer that honestly. He isn't like the man on the cross that says, you know what, if you're the real Messiah, let's get down from this cross. He isn't like those who were around the cross and they said, you know what, if you're the real Messiah, why don't you send legions of angels down to protect you? Because we don't believe it unless that happens. John doesn't actually say any of that. He says, are you the one? No conditions, even if there's confusion. But very quickly now, he doesn't shy away from the fact he will search for a real Messiah if Jesus is not that Messiah. We know we need a Messiah. Everyone has in their minds that they need a Messiah. And if we reject Jesus as the Messiah, guess what we're all going to do? We're all going to go looking for another Messiah. We're going to look for one in some area of life. We're going to go looking for our plan B Messiah. The one who promises our kingdom, all the little things that we want in life. We'll work hard and we'll call God plan A, but really we have our hats and our coats on. Saying, you know what, if this doesn't work out, I'm pretty powerful as an American. I'm pretty free, I'm pretty rich. I got plenty of plan Bs and Cs and Ds if this doesn't work out. We know we need a Messiah. Our doubt in Jesus creates our false messiahs. You know, the less we believe in Jesus as a country, as a group, as a church, as a person, the more we will have stars, politicians, and religious gurus step in and be the answer to our problems. And guess what they want? They want their kingdoms. We're just buying into their kingdoms and giving ourselves over. And it isn't a kingdom based on love and obedience and working together. It's one on their own kingdom being built up. And a lot of these people aren't intentionally doing it. We can make very good people who have no wrong things our Messiah. I've seen people take very good preachers who have no interest in being a Messiah, and somebody tries to make them into their Messiah. Because we're all looking for something. It seems modern poetry and music kind of compete to make such promises that I'll be your everything. You know this country song? I'll be your everything. I'll be your everything. You know that song? And then there was a time period where it seemed to be that was the thing to do, right? I'll be your hero. I can be your hero, baby. You remember that song? Some of you don't know it. Look it up on YouTube later. Okay, for some of y'all, you'll know this song. You'll definitely know this song. It was, you are my soul and what? My life's inspiration. You're all I got to get me by. I'm not singing this one. Maybe. You are my soul and my life's inspiration. Without you, baby, what good am I? Right? I mean, I love those songs. They're good, lovey-dovey songs, and they're fine when they're in their proper context. But we're all competing, right? You're my everything. I'm going to put everything on you. We're in movies. You complete me. Oh, chambers. I can't even remember the name of the movie, but it was Tom Cruise. Yes, Jerry Maguire. What good am I without this or that? We just live that. We're told that that's real love. That's real, what it means to be married or love with each other. What good am I without this or that? Look at your bank account, your career. It could be a loved one. You put all that weight on them. What good am I without you, without the bank account or the loved one or whatever? People can't, nothing else is meant to handle that burden. Only Jesus Christ can handle that burden that you would say, what good am I without you? That's it. I get the lovey-doveyness of the songs. I love it too. But when you're getting real to it, this is what it's about. Is it really your bank account, your career, your loved one that can't handle the burden? But most of us think, without this, what good am I? You may only find out what your real plan B has been all along when you lose it. And then you have this sudden feeling in your soul that says, what good am I? I'm nothing. I realize that I feel worthless. What do we do with that? What do we do with our doubts? What do we do with our false messiahs? Jesus' reply to John is still relevant to us. It sounds kind of like what happened way back when. But he says, the blind receive sight, the lame walks, the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them. I hope maybe you put together that when we read from Isaiah chapter 35 earlier, you would have heard the reference. Jesus is referencing Isaiah chapter 35 and chapter 29, which we didn't read, which is a sign and a symbol. He says Isaiah says, that is what a Messiah, Isaiah said, prophesied, this is what the Messiah is going to do. This is what it's going to look like. And Jesus says, look, I'm doing what Isaiah said I should be doing. What does John need to realize? What does John need to realize here? He's added a whole bunch of stuff to what he thinks Jesus needs to be doing. He's leaning on tradition. Tradition started adding all kinds of things to what they expected. Their imagination started adding, and because they presumed that conquering and that God could conquer and power always meant violence. It always meant using swords. It always meant using spears. That's how you conquered things. They presumed that. And because they presumed that, they couldn't understand Jesus. And Jesus says, look, I'm actually doing what Isaiah said I should be doing. What actually Jesus, through Isaiah, said that he would be doing, right? He says, I'm it. The point of this is Jesus saying, I'm it, and there's no plan B. God doesn't have a plan B. Jesus is the plan, the only plan, the one plan, and anything else that you try to make into a plan is not God's plan. First, we need to understand God. We learn from this. I want you to learn from this thing. First, we need to understand God before we try to understand ourselves. You see that was what he's doing? He's saying, I need to know if you're the one. I need to understand you because I'm not understanding my situation. John's getting this right. We can't understand our wants, our needs, our desires, our calling, our situation, our pains, our suffering until we understand who Jesus is. And we may not fully ever understand those things, but John's open question implies that if Jesus is really the Messiah, and if Jesus says, love your enemies, and your family may suffer, then we have to deal with that. If he's really the Messiah, then John's going to have to deal with his prison. Those are hard words. But can you imagine the stability, even in prison, that brings him? That he served the true one God and the true one Messiah. And that his prison life and that his death is not for nothing. It's not a mistake. It's not a situation of misidentification. It's a statement of saying, I've suffered and I've lived for God. Most of the time we seek to make sure God understands us and then grade him or the Bible and how he fixes our problem. But true discipleship, dealing with our doubt, says, I'm going to understand you, Lord, through your scriptures, through your community, through your messages, through your spirit, before I try to understand my situation and my plan for life. See, doubt and confusion itself is not evil. A lot of people act like doubt is kind of the worst thing somebody can go through. Absolutely not. Doubt is something everyone goes through. And it's just part of life. You're going to have doubts. You're going to have struggles. We are limited creatures, and we're going to doubt. But here's something I think that John does so well that helps us learn how to doubt properly. John keeps his faith in one hand, and he keeps his doubt in the other. He keeps his doubt, you might say, inside of his faith. He might be looking for the true Messiah, but he trusts God will send one. He might doubt it's Jesus, but he knows God's faithful. Jesus doesn't say, how dare you? You're like this evil generation. How dare you doubt me? He answers the question. He says, yeah, I'm kind of a hard pill to swallow, and blessed are those who are not offended. I mean, Jesus knows his message is difficult. He says it over and over again. That's why he says at the end, those who have ears, let them hear. That means what I'm saying is very difficult for us to process. The key is that there is no evidence of hard-heartedness in John's question. When asking God openly and humbly, it creates a chance, an opportunity for John to grow closer to Jesus. He has an opportunity to fully and more fully grasp who Jesus is. That's what doubt or asking questions when you're full of confusion can do for you. You ask it inside of the faith. We must take our doubts and really ask God what to do with them. I promise there are answers to the doubts that you have and the doubts that you feel. And maybe you haven't wrestled with some of those things, but I promise in the Christian tradition, there are people, men and women, saints as we might call us, who have wrestled with many of the doubts that you feel and have come up with answers and responses. Not to give you an absolute 100 kind of scientific proof, because that wouldn't be faith anymore, but to really give an absolutely wonderful answer to your doubts. And I'd be happy to help you point to those answers, to those things in life that are pulling you down. I remember one of my greatest points of struggle and doubt in my life happened when I really read the Bible well. That doesn't make sense, does it? My greatest doubts that I've ever gone through in my life happened when I read the Bible well. Doubt about God creeped in my heart because I thought the only way the Bible could be interpreted and read was to my and the world, my kind of group's standard at the time. It had to be read this particular way to be true. And I kept reading it well, and I couldn't make it mesh. I couldn't make it work. And Christians regularly have had gall, and I called it myself, and that's toward me, have had the gall to tell God how he must write the Bible. He must write it to this particular historical kind of standard, and I'm talking, I had a really high standard, that if it didn't match that standard of what I think is truth writing or something like that, then Bible couldn't be real. But do you see what I'm doing? I'm saying that I'm a better author than God about writing true. I don't take it as true and then figure out what it is. I decide how I think something true should be written and decide did God write it that way? I've made myself a better author than him. I face the decision to submit to God how he wrote the Bible through people, or I could choose to hold him to my standard of how to write a religious document and walk away. I wrestled with holding on to this faith. I was like Jacob. I was wrestling God over many of these particular topics. It took years between God and myself till I came out to the other side and realized that God's Bible is better than anything I could even interpret from it. Better than anything I could ever glean from it. It's more beautiful than any summary or standard I could put upon it, more wonderful than any sermon that I could try to use to explain it. It's grander than any historian could have ever captured. Doubt doesn't have to destroy you. It can get you in sync with Jesus if you take it to him. If you face doubts, if you have people who face doubts, where do we go? Do you have a place to go? I'm right here. The Bible's right around you, all around you. But you have to take it seriously and ask God in good faith, are you the expected one? Or do I need to look for another Messiah? I trust that you can ask him that question because I know he's got an answer for you. Faith is believing what Jesus believed. Faith is believing what Jesus believed. Doubt, I'll flip this around for you. Doubt is trying to make Jesus believe what you believe. Real faith is believing what Jesus believed. when we're talking about discipleship or evangelizing, we must be very careful not to be a know-it-all. We often condense Jesus and gospel down to some simple ideas and some simple phrases, rather than stating that the good news is greater than we could ever even express. We need to compress it and condense it. We need to have a way to communicate it very easily and thoroughly, but we need to not act like we just delivered the entire Bible to them in 30 seconds. People often say that all you have to do is believe in Jesus. And true as that is, we have to be kind of clear about what we mean by that. It means more than agreeing with Jesus and saying, yes, he's a Messiah, he's a really good guy. He was a really smart, wise man. It's more than saying, yes, he was the Son of God or is the Son of God. It's more than even saying that, yes, I believe he died and he rose again. That it happened, that it's a historical fact. You need to believe that thing. But that's not his fullness of what it means to believe in Jesus. It means believing Jesus, believing him, believing what he said is true. That everything he did is everything that matters. It is believing what Jesus believed about how the world works, about how relationships work. You may not fully grasp it all, but you say, Jesus, I'm going to believe what you're going to believe, and I'm going to follow that. See, it isn't just that Jesus accomplished something for you. He accomplished before you. Before you got there. Because he says, take up my cross and follow me. So yes, what he did makes it possible for us to take up our cross and follow him. But we don't leave it that he just did something for us and now I'm like, oh good, thanks. Now I don't have to worry about eternity. No, it's take up your cross and follow me. What he accomplished is what he accomplished not just for us, but before us. And we walk that same path of dying to ourselves, of dying even for our enemies, of giving ourselves over for the kingdom, of loving people who don't love us. To understand him is to understand then your own life, your own goals, your own plans. He, Jesus Christ, not some written law of do's and don'ts, is the standard measure of your life. And if you choose that, you choose life. And you choose resurrection. And you choose abundance as the kingdom provides. Because he says here, the least in the kingdom are greater than John. Simply, Jesus is saying, and he says a lot more than this actually, but Jesus is, for his little ones, the acceptable plan A. And that they will not just suffer and die in prison, but they will know fully resurrection. Not that John will. John's going to have to make his decision. We don't know what John decided. John's disciples were gone by this time. I assume John chose plan A. But he's saying that the new kingdom is so much higher and so much loftier and transcendent than the old way and the old way of thinking and even the old promise, the covenant, that the least in his kingdom is greater than those in the old, in the last. To be in God's kingdom is a higher automatically than living by the world's standard powers, prestige, fame, or wealth. My question this morning is, do you believe what Jesus believes? I know I want to, but do we have a plan B for trouble, for enemies? Is plan A for Christians and people we get along with and I'm going to love and treat this certain way, but we have a plan B for people we don't like? Or a job that's just really a pain in the neck? Do we die for our enemies or want to make them disappear? Do we want to forgive people who hurt us or ignore them and condemn them? Jesus defines the kingdom. We follow or we fall. Come, let us walk together, following him.